One of the things that's very significant about this general instruction, and we must be aware of this as we go about the business of implementation this year. I will do penance for my sins by looking on the liturgical blogs, and I don't care if it's right-wing or left-wing. They speak with an infallibility that our Holy Father is too humble to claim. And they will say that they and only they, and this is how it should be done, and so on. And it's very divisive. And one of the things that I find with this is the phrase, the new Mass. What we are doing on the 27th of November is not introducing a new Mass. It is the Mass of Paul VI that came out of the reform of Vatican II with new translated text. And the rubrical changes, for the most part, are geared to further deepening the implementation of the reforms and the vision of Vatican II. It's not a new Mass. And I mention this because increasingly on some blogs, I'm hearing this phrase that the Mass of Paul VI and what's happened since Vatican II has been a break with tradition. And I'm hearing things like, we went off the rails after Vatican II. These are not helpful expressions. The reform of Vatican II was the most radical reform in our history, where all of our liturgical books were changed in a matter of a few days, for heaven's sake. And when it first happened, things were done so rapidly that, yes, there were some things that left us a little bit, what? I'll give you an example. I was a sacristan with the Augustinians at that time. I was a novice at the monastery in Nova Scotia. And we didn't have a missal on our altars. We had text coming out from the chancery for the following month. Our missals were comprised of ring binders on the altar. And I remember the very first Sunday with use of the vernacular, and it was for the rite of dismissal. And what came from the chancery was, the Mass is ended. So I remember the prior, and we had about 300 people. They would come from the surrounding community for Sunday morning Mass because it was early at 6:30. And so the church chapel was full at the monastery. And the prior stands up there and says, the Mass is ended. And 300 people said, thanks be to God. It was not much different from my friend saying, take me home, Ma, it's not worth it. Thank God that's over for another week. Within a week, we had a note from the chancery, please change the dismissal rite to go forth in the peace of Christ. So I use that as a simple example, but there were others. And as Cardinal Casper said a few years ago, after a deep after a deep freeze, when you finally get a thaw, you can expect things to be muddy for a while. So in the implementation in those years, there's muddiness. But that does not and should not take away from the great reform of Vatican II. And the fact that, no, we weren't doing things wrong in these past 40 years. But when the Missal was published here in Canada in 1975, it was made clear that there would need to be a revision because this had been done so quickly. And it would have to be done more completely and more thoroughly. And that's what this is. This is how it's resulted in this today. Now, mind you, in 1975, they said the work should be completed within 5 years. And here we are finally getting around to it. But my point is that it is a document that is based in the notion of continuity and tradition. And this is important because some of these voices of saying it's a break with tradition, they're hearkening back to 1969, when a group of people, including some well-placed hierarchy in the world, publicly attacked Pope Paul VI and said that his missal was a total break with tradition. At that time, the general instruction did not contain paragraphs 1 to 15. Those were added as a reaction to this attack of Pope Paul VI. And by the way, of some significance in my opinion, one of the people who led that defense of Pope Paul VI was a young German theologian by the name of Joseph Ratzinger, whom we today know by a different name. And then paragraphs 1 to 15 were added to the general instruction in 1970 in defense of the work of Paul VI and the concilium that was tasked with implementing the reforms of the council. Paragraphs 1 to 15, as put in 1970's instruction, are completely repeated in this instruction. So this is a document that is very much a document of continuity and tradition. And in fact, I want to read this little note, number 6, from paragraphs from the preamble. In setting forth its instructions for the revision of the order of Mass, the Second Vatican Council, using the same words as did St. Pius V in the Apostolic Constitution Quo Primum, by which the Missal of Trent was promulgated in 1570, also ordered, among other things, that some rites be restored to the original norm of the Holy Fathers. From the fact that the same words are used, it can be seen how the Roman Missals, although separated by 4 centuries, embrace one and the same tradition. The point that he's making here, in the Reform of Trent, they called for returning to the norm of the early church fathers, the golden patristic age. And as work progressed with studying these works, they used that as the basis for the Reform of Trent. When you look at the works, especially of Pius XII in his great encyclicals on the liturgy, he constantly refers to the great work of the 19th and 20th centuries of both scriptural studies and the liturgical movement, of having delved more deeply into the patristic era and having so broadened our knowledge of the theology of Scripture and the liturgy. And that now, and Pius XII says it, the fruit of that scholarship will be brought to bear on liturgical reform. Vatican II took that and did it. And so in this preamble it says, no, this is not a break with tradition. It is very much in line with the same principle that guided the Reform of Trent, so that these 2 great councils, separated by 4 centuries, are operating under the same principle. That's important to know in terms of where the rubber hits the road with some of our arguments that we will encounter as we do this today. I will just take one example. The use of Latin. That's become a hot-button issue around today. I was at one conference where a young man was saying, it was never the intention of the Council Fathers to have the entire liturgical celebration in Latin, just the liturgy of the Word, not the canon. And he kept insisting on that. And I was trying gently to discuss with him and say things like, within a year of the closure of the Council, the bishops of Canada, as well as the other conferences of the world, voted on the matter of vernacular, and almost unanimously voted in favor of the entire celebration to be done in the vernacular, which led to the work of the translations of our books. And I would say to him, the fact that within a year, almost unanimously, the bishops voted on this matter and approved full use of the vernacular tells me that it was the will of the council to do this, of the council fathers. Well, he wasn't buying that argument. At one point, this very elderly gentleman came up to the microphone, cane, and comes to the mic and says, young man, please forgive me. I'm getting old. My eyesight is weaker than it was, and my memory is failing. But I don't recall seeing you at the council. And it was at that time, one of our surviving council fathers, who then proceeded to say, I was there for all 4 years. I guarantee you it was our intention to proceed with full implementation of vernacular. Now, I mention this for 2 reasons. Because in this general instruction, it'll talk about Gregorian chant has pride of place in our tradition. And then it includes polyphony. And so some of these people will quote that and say we should be doing this at our masses. But read the second half of the sentence. It says, Gregorian chant has pride of place in our sacraments and polyphony, and so, providing the principle of full conscious active participation is respected. Providing. That means it can only be used when you guarantee that full conscious providing. So I'll give you 2 examples. And the reason I do this is because you've got some people saying that Mass is more reverent when it's in Latin. Well, what's that say to our Ukrainian brothers and sisters? And then you got other people, if you even mention one use of one Latin phrase in the liturgy, they break out in hives. So we've got these two extremes. And so I'll give you an example. The phrase here that's important in that rubric, providing the principle of full conscious active participation is respected, which is one of the cornerstone principles of the document on sacred liturgy. So I was at a celebration within the last year where there were 3 priests, myself included, the presider and 2 concelebrants, an assembly of about 600 people. When it came time for the Lord's Prayer, the presider, and he had not even told the 2 of us about this, the 2 concelebrants, the presider introduces the Lord's Prayer by saying, "And now let us pray in the words that Jesus taught us. Pater noster, qui es in caelo." There were 3 people praying, him and the 2 priests. Nobody in church was singing. I compare that to the experience at the Eucharistic Congress in Quebec a couple of years ago. When it came time for the prayer of the faithful, the universal intercessions, people from every country in the world came up to the ambo to present the intentions. The intentions were done in every language on the face of this planet. French, Spanish, English, Italian, Cree, Swahili, Urdu, they were all there. And at the end of each intention, the deacon from the ambo proclaimed or invited people to pray with "Oremus," and 12,000 of us responded, "Te rogamus audi nos." We knew what it meant, "This we ask you, hear us." It was in the little bulletin. But I compare these 2 examples from this perspective. I don't care here what a person's personal preferences are about music. We've got to stop imposing personal taste on our assemblies. I don't care from whence they come. Full conscious active participation. The experience with the Pater Noster effectively did not respect the principle of full conscious active participation. It removed a prayer that is so important to our assemblies from the assembly. Whereas in Quebec, the use of "Te rogamus audi nos" unified the assembly. It really did. And the people who do that well are the people of Thésée in France, where they have so many languages around the world. They do it well. Now, international gatherings have not been as common an occurrence here in Canada as they have been in Europe, but it's going to increase. And when you read the instruction, when it talks about preserving the patrimony of Latin, particularly for international gatherings, it's presented as a unifying principle, not as one to take the prayer of the people away from them. So we have to unpack these rubrics in such a way that we know the intention of the rubric. What value is being presented here? But this business of Latin as a language that's more reverent, well, does that mean that the Eucharist of the first 300 years in our church were irreverent? Because Latin was not the language of the church. It was Greek. And before the sad split between East and West in the 11th century, when our bishops gathered, Eucharist was celebrated in Latin, Arabic, Aramaic, Spanish. And when you look at Latin, and I'm not downgrading Latin, I happen to love the language, to tell you the truth, but if those of us old enough to remember, when Pope Paul VI addressed the United Nations in 1963, he did it in French, because French is the official language of the diplomatic world, and he was at the United Nations. Did you know that the official language of air traffic controllers throughout the world is English for that communication? Well, that was the nature of Latin as the Roman Empire collapsed and as things changed in Europe. It was the language of communication. It was the language of professionals. Doctors were trained in Latin. University professors taught in Latin. And liturgy was celebrated in Latin. But in no way does that add more reverence to the celebration. I grew up in the Tridentine Rite, and I watched it make very holy saints of a lot of people. And I actually developed my love for liturgy at that monastery in the celebration of Holy Week according to the Tridentine Rite. I prayed the breviary with all 9 nocturnes. But I also had the experience of why the conventual Mass was being celebrated at the main altar. We novices had to serve the private Masses of the priest down the side of the chapel. And I could serve one man's Mass at 7, another at 7:15, another at 7:45, and still be on time for breakfast at 8. It was done very quickly, and these were holy men. But what I'm saying is, the Tridentine Mass can be celebrated with great reverence or with great carelessness. The Mass of Paul VI can be celebrated with great reverence or great carelessness. Reverence is not restricted to the language. It's an attitude. It's an attitude that we must nurture. And this general instruction makes great points about the need for reverence, but it doesn't restrict it to a particular language or a particular gesture. It brings in that whole thing I was talking about earlier of symbolic language and communication and robustness of symbols. Doing what the document asks us to do and do it well. This Vatican II's reform of the liturgy was not a break with tradition. It was very much in line with tradition. And this document continues that spirit of continuity. It asks us to take the symbols that are of great importance and strengthen them and allow them to communicate the mystery of God's presence. One of the things that Vatican II said in its presentation and in the reform of the liturgy was that accretions through the centuries had to be cut away in order to get back to the essential, that each generation had added its layer of accretions to the celebration of the liturgy. I think of the image of a snowball with a rock in it. And as you roll that snowball along, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and each roll puts a new layer of snow, and eventually you don't even know that there's a rock in there. Well, each generation adds stuff to the liturgy. And what Vatican II said, it's time to cut through the layers of the centuries and the accretions, and so that the most important structure and meaning of the liturgy is again made evident and accessible. And this document continues to push us in that way, to fully implement it.